Today I've got something fun for those who want to learn more about story creation. I was recently invited to submit a short story to a new anthology called Unbroken. And I was happy to accept, in part because it's a charity anthology, and the proceeds go toward helping friend and fellow fantasy author Peter Orullian and his wife get out from under some severe medical debt. I'll tell you more about the anthology and where you can find it in just a second, but I thought it would be a great opportunity to detail story creation from inception all the way through the writing of the first words. I'm not going to go into the writing itself, that's not the focus of this video. What I do want to share is the entire brainstorming and plotting process. Why? Because I think it helps to see how other authors work. You might find a few tips along the way that you can use in your own writing. So I'm going to cover things like how I considered the theme of the anthology, because it is themed, how I created the setting, the characters, the fantasy elements, and how I took all of that and plotted the story at a high level. What I ended up with was a story that was ready to be written. I could open up the first blank page and start typing. So this is the beginning to end of stage one of the writing process. Keep in mind that this is for a novella, but I think that's the perfect size for something like this. A novel would take too long to detail, and a really short story might not have enough meat on it. But a novella sits right in the middle, and I think you can take some of the approach that I'm going to go over and apply it to stories of any size. Also keep in mind that this is just one approach. There are plenty of others, and I myself don't always approach stories the same way. That said, I think seeing how other authors work can be illuminating. So my hope here is that by showing you how I tackled what ended up being a sizable novella, it might give you some ideas on how to approach your own stories and move them from some initial conception to something you can actually start putting words to. So stick around. Hey, if you're new to the channel, I'm Brad Bollier, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author with a dozen novels, tons of short stories, and 20 plus years of experience in the field of writing. I started a novel approach to share hard-earned lessons on writing, editing, publishing, and the business of writing, so you hopefully don't have to go through the same pain I did. If that sounds up your alley, be sure to subscribe, and if you find this video useful, I hope you'll like, share, and maybe buy me a coffee on ko-fi.com. Link in the description below. I mentioned I was going to tell you more about the anthology. It's called Unbroken, and it's being published by Grim Oak Press, who've done a number of anthologies over the years and other books as well, including more charity anthologies. In fact, the founder of Grim Oak Press, Sean Speakman, started his journey to owning and running a publishing house by publishing a charity anthology to tackle his own medical debt. It's a similar situation now with Peter Orullian and his wife, who've both had some tough health situations to deal with. So Peter decided to run a similar anthology to Sean's, and Sean offered to help. The response has been great, and you can see just how many authors have joined the cause. I'm showing you the Kickstarter page at this point, and you can go here. There's a link in the description below. You can also search on Kickstarter for Unbroken, New Tales by Masters of Fantasy, and you can just scroll down a little bit. It's not live yet as of the taping of this video. It is supposed to go live roughly September of 2025. If you're watching this in late 2025 or beyond, the anthology is likely out by now, so you can go ahead and look for the Unbroken anthology and click buy at your bookseller of choice. For the time being, we have this teaser, and we can see some of the great art that was donated by Donato Giancola, and below you can see all of the authors that will have a story in this, let's face it, pretty stunning anthology. I'm really proud to be a part of it, and I'm happy that it's going to help Peter and his wife. Again, on Kickstarter, you can sign up to be notified for when it goes live. I have already done that, but you should see something like click here to be notified when there's news about this Kickstarter. So go ahead and click that. At the least, you'll be notified and you can take a look at it and hopefully join in. Okay, so here is my story. It's called The Awkward Inquisitor and the Dragon Egg Thief. It is written at this point, but again, I'm not going to cover that part of it. I want to talk about how I started, how I developed things until I could get to that first page. So it ended up being 6 chapters in all and roughly 23,000 words. And what I'd like to do is to go through a number of things, including the early ideas that I had given the theme of the story, the characters that got created along the way or that I reused because this is an existing story that I'm taking the world from and expanding on it, and then how I detailed the plot as I went along. And that grew as I worked more and more on the ideas of the story. So this is Scrivener, and I have a whole series of videos on Scrivener if you want to learn more about it, and you can find the link to that right up here. But I'm going to close the binder on the left-hand side and just try to focus on the things that I want to focus on and not have that clutter up the screen. So we'll hide the binder. Well, let me go here first, set myself up with the first document I want to go over, and then I'll hide that binder. So the story theme is Unbroken. It's supposed to have an antagonist who is desperate and either can't or won't give up. I wanted to show the character as having been through a lot and still persevering. That's what Unbroken meant to me. And so that advised me on one of the main characters, not the POV character, which we'll see in a second, but the focus character of this story. And I also knew for some time before this anthology even came up that I wanted to write a story about Lorelei, who is an inquisitor for a Roman-style empire, and Creed, who is her partner in later stories in The Dragons of Deepwood Fen and the Book of the Holt trilogy. But I wanted to set this before that, years before, when they became partners. Lorelei was initially partners with a man named Kellen, and Kellen is getting set to retire, and that's how she got hooked up with Creed. But I wanted there to be some friction between those two. And so Creed and Lorelei aren't going to be compatible early on. They won't get along. And so the story will reveal other sides of them both. They'll start to learn about each other initially, and that will lead to their partnering. So note that these first two things are talking about external arc. That's the character who's going to be going through a lot and still persevering. I didn't even know who he was yet, but he is going to be the focus of the external arc. And the internal arc is going to be about Lorelei and how she comes to know Creed, who is kind of gruff and maybe a bit standoffish to her. That's her perception. He actually isn't that way, she realizes later on. But Lorelei is pretty quirky. She is on the spectrum. She has a photographic memory. She doesn't do well in social situations. And so I wanted to play that out in the story as she gets more and more comfortable with Creed and realizes that maybe she could be a partner and even a friend. And so I want you to do that as well. Early on, very early on, think about the external arc, yes, but also think about the internal arc and what the story is going to mean to the main character or characters. Okay, and then from this point forward, I did a lot of just kind of off the top of my head brainstorming. And so I have things like, I'm thinking the thief is from Creed's homeland, and that would allow Creed to have a part in this story. It would be a natural way for him to get involved, to help Lorelei out. I didn't end up using that, but that's what came to me first, so I jotted it down. Later on, I thought I would center this around the Emerald Isles. Now, Creed's homeland is on the sea, and south of there is a chain of islands called the Lost Emeralds. And those people emigrated a long, long time ago, some of them, to the Holt and gave rise to the kin who live there that we see in the Dragons of Deepwood Fen and beyond. And so I wanted to detail them a little bit and talk about the islands. They're kind of a Maori Islander style culture. I wanted to expand on that and show them, but I also wanted to show the world. And so I started thinking about what is going to be the focus of this main character who ended up being Cowrie. He's a man who ends up going after his son. His son, as it turns out, has passed. He has died, but his soul has been taken from his body, his dead body, as a wisp. In this world, in the Book of the Holt, there's the concept of wisps, and they are our souls, essentially, and they lift from our remains decades, generations, maybe even centuries after our deaths. And in this case, someone quickened Cowrie's son's soul and put it in a dragon egg. And the reason he did that was to make the egg glow, to be able to sell it. He and his father, he inherited this art from him, created these eggs to sell in the Empire. Again, I did not know that at the time, but I say this because I started to have this notion of someone stealing a valuable dragon egg early on. I wanted to sort of highlight the dragon-esque nature of the Book of the Holt, but I spend a ton of time in the other books talking about these large dragon breeds, and I wanted to have like a smaller, different kind of dragon breed, like a dragonlet or a wormling, that sort of thing, a drake. And so that's what Kaori's son, Tio, was put into. And so someone is trying to steal that egg for some reason. There's a thief, and they want to take it. The dragons involved here are small. They're no bigger than condors when fully grown. I started to detail what these dragons were about, and I thought, well, maybe, how does it get there? How is someone going to sell this egg? Well, maybe there's a caravan coming from the islands, or at least someone from the islands has come and joined this caravan. They arrive in the city of Ancrus, where Lorelai and Creed are from. The egg gets stolen. Lorelai and Creed get called in. That was kind of the very early thoughts about how the story was going to go. That was the kernel. And so that leads me to the early cast of characters. So I was thinking Lorelai Aurelius, Kellen, who is her partner, Creed, who is not her partner yet, and she doesn't know well, and so she's quite standoffish towards him, and they will become partners in this story. So those are three obvious characters. I thought about including Ordrin, who is a nasty inquisitor who's on the take from the first book, The Dragons of Deepwood Fen. I ended up rejecting that idea eventually, but this is the sort of thing that happens. You'll just kind of jot down ideas of characters that you want to be involved, and maybe they work and maybe they don't. It's all grist for the mill, right? You're kind of turning this stuff over and over and seeing what stands out to you. What is to your taste for this particular story that you want to write? And slowly but surely you fit that into a story-sized piece of writing. So we'll talk about plot in 1 second. I was thinking the auctioneer was going to get this, have it in some auction house and try to sell it, but the thief would get it before they could. And I did that initially because I had that in book 1, a auctioneer and something being stolen. And I'm like, well, maybe that's something that could happen again. But then it started to feel repetitive. And so I rejected that eventually. But again, initially, that's what I put down. And maybe there's a caravan owner who brought it from the islands. And these Dracora, they are dragon riders. So they are soldiers in service to the Empire. And so I thought maybe they'd be involved too. I didn't know if there was going to be 1 or 2 of them at this point. So very early cast of characters. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this idea of jotting down all your ideas in one document. Again, a kind of stream of consciousness. I'm pausing the video here because I misspoke. This is actually not the brainstorming document. It is instead a miscellaneous scene ideas document. What I have in this document are ideas for scenes that could be fully formed, only partially formed, but they're glimpses of what scenes could be in the eventual story. And I jot them down in a separate document because I don't want to lose track of them in that brainstorming document, which gets pretty large by the end. So I just plop them in this separate document, and then I consider them as I'm getting ready to plot or write the story. And so in the end, I'll have kind of 3 main documents that help me write: the brainstorming document, which we've covered, this miscellaneous scene ideas document, and then the plot itself. The brainstorming doc is one that helps me to flesh out ideas, but they're really just kind of a, again, hodgepodge stream of consciousness. The miscellaneous scene ideas document here is a bit more mature and things that I want to keep track of to put in the story eventually. And then the plot is more of a stakes in the ground type of document that start getting my head around how I'm going to write this, how things are going to progress, how I'm going to build the story, portray these characters as sympathetic, and build towards a resolution that's going to resonate for the reader in the end. And so as I'm going over this document in this next little section, just keep in mind that these are miscellaneous ideas that came to me and that I knew I wanted to put into the story somewhere. Again, these aren't necessarily in order, and then I worked them into the story eventually, or sometimes not. You know, sometimes a scene idea doesn't work out and I don't use it, but this is what I use this document for. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. I'm going to use this convention of things that we've covered before. I'm going to put in this gold font, and the stuff that we care about, the new stuff, is going to be in white. So I started jotting things down about Kaori, the father who's going after his son, stealing the egg again. I didn't really know that at that point. Note here, I have Lorelai being called to investigate a murder scene. I was thinking somebody got killed during that process, and I didn't even know if Kaori was the one to do it or not. But the constables have a suspect, and Lorelai was going to be put on the case essentially, along with Creed. And because Lorelai is very sharp and intuitive and picks things up without even really realizing it at first, sometimes she goes over scenes, crime scenes later, and things come to her. So something odd at the crime scene will make her think, what's going on here? Something is not quite as it seems. And I was thinking at first that the accused would be given some way out, but they won't take it because they need that egg. And this convinces Lorelai there's more to the story. And so she pushes to get the real story. And in the end, she's going to stand up for and represent this wrongly accused person. Maybe there'll be a courtroom scene, and Creed will assist in some way in finding some crucial bit of information for her to win this case and to see this person gain justice in the end. Toward the end, I had this idea of the artisan, the one who ended up killing Tio, the son of Cowrie, and putting his soul in the egg to sell it in the Empire, ends up getting his comeuppance at the end. He tries to take the egg back, and there's a scuffle, and he dies. And note that I haven't put a lot of structure to the story yet. I have kind of a very vague idea of how the story opens, somewhat how it progresses, and then how it closes. But it's super fuzzy at this point. I could not start writing any of this right now. And so what I will do is start putting that into some kind of structure. And the one that I've been using most the last bunch of years is 7-point story structure. And this was based on a talk given by Dan Wells. Dan is the author of I Am Not a Serial Killer and other novels. So Dan gave a talk that was broken up into 5 different 10-minute roughly sections. Not really sure why, maybe because of limitations of the camera that they were using or something. And he detailed 7 distinct steps that you can use for building a story, and they are here. So part 1 is the hook. Something interesting happens, but it's also the opposite of the end state. And I'm not going to go into detail here. You can watch Dan's video, which I'll link in the description below. So we initially have the hook. It draws us in. This may be the inciting incident. It doesn't have to be. And then there's plot turn 1. The story moves from the beginning toward the midpoint. The character's world changes in some way. And I'm going to show you how I use this for my story. And so you'll see these again at the end. I'll go over the entire story with these particular high points. And then part 3 is pinch 1. It forces the characters into action. And then we reach the midpoint. The characters move from reaction to action. Pinch 2 applies even more pressure. This is the jaws of defeat for the story. We have plot turn 2. The character gets the last piece they need to make it happen, to win the day, whatever that means for them. And then finally, we have the resolution, the climax of the tale. I found this slightly incomplete, so I add 2 more on my plotting structure, and those are the opening, the early pages, which often includes the inciting incident. I did talk about this in detail in my video on plotting, which you can see up above. I'll add the link there. And I talk a bit about the inciting incident, but also the initial conditions. And that's why I added this opening. I want to learn and detail for myself what things are like as they lead up to that inciting incident. What is the world like for the main characters and the antagonists? I like to think about that and detail that as I go along. And then also at the very end, the denouement wraps up the tale in some satisfying way. And I like to think about that because it is often an echo of other things that are going on, often the internal arc of the character. And so I want to be able to detail that so I can know if I'm hitting my marks or not. And so this is the structure that I use. You could call it 9-point if you want. Okay, so given what I've detailed so far, I felt I had enough to start putting that into formal structure. And so I have this opening, and so I have things like Kellen calls Lorelai into his office and gives her the case. And as it turns out, he's retiring, but he doesn't want to let on. And so he has to tell her about the case, but also hand her off to Creed so that they can be introduced, basically. And so Lorelai, being Lorelai, is a bit freaked out by this situation. She wants to go with Kellen, but Kellen stands his ground and sends Creed to go with her. And so then I was thinking too, well, do I need an excuse for Creed to be there? Couldn't she just go on her own? Is this a dangerous place to go? They often work as partners, and so Kellen just pushes her. Sometimes one can see something the other can't. And so she ends up going with Creed, and they arrive at this, what I thought was going to be an auction house. So that's the first step. And then we get to the next one. And so again, I've detailed the opening. Now we're focusing on the hook. Again, I have enough from those early brainstorming thoughts to detail the hook as well. So again, this is something interesting, but also the opposite of the end state, the resolution. And so Lorelai gets this case, she goes to the scene, and she finds something interesting, something that tells her that all is not as it seems. The story that the people at this auction house, which ends up being a curiosity shop in the end, doesn't match up with the facts on the scene. And so this gets her thinking that there's something more, and she starts digging. And then we get to plot turn 1. This moves the story from beginning towards the midpoint, and the character's world changes. The case maybe involves somebody's life, somebody personal to Lorelai maybe. That didn't pan out, but that's what I thought initially. Then we move on to pinch 1. So something forces the character into action. Notice it's really sparse at this point because I didn't have enough to put down, but I wanted to put a stake in the ground even if I had to move it later. So I'm just starting to try to get a handle on the main points of the story so that I can then fill things in from there. And so I'm thinking, well, as they're gathering clues, maybe they get attacked by somebody because they don't want them to find the truth, something along those lines. Again, super fuzzy at this point. And then we have the midpoint. Characters move from reaction to action. So I'm thinking Creed needs to play a part here. He needs to show his worth, and he needs to start getting closer to Lorelai and vice versa in some way. So maybe he finds some crucial bit of information or gives some insight to Lorelai that helps her solve the case. So those two characters are getting closer. And that's as far as I felt I could take it at the time. I needed to work out more. I had this notion of these dragons. I wanted to think more about them and how they mattered to the main characters, especially Cowrie and his son Tio, and a man named Hecatoro, who is the one that killed Tio in the end. And so I went back to that idea document where I was just jotting down random stream of consciousness type ideas. So again, I've covered this gold section up here. I'm going to move down. And so I just started thinking about the dragon breeds, the family that they're from. This is again, Roman style empire. They're fairly advanced in some of the sciences. And so they detailed the different dragon breeds and beyond, different species of plants and animals. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe there's a family of dragons and it's called dragonlets or drakes or wormlings. And the species, I had no idea. I ended up settling on needlewing in the end, but this follows my typical course for names. And if I want a name, if it's important to the story, I almost always have to stop. I just can't go on with like a generic name or one that I know isn't a fit for the story. And so I'll just write down a whole bunch of them, keep playing those around in my mind until something stands out. And so then I started thinking, well, what are the drakes like and where do they live? I mean, there's very, very large dragons in some places. And so where do these live? It might make sense for them to live on the islands where large game is less plentiful. And so the dragons would naturally be smaller too, and maybe even feed on fish. And so then I'm also thinking about the thief who steals the egg. You know, what did they steal it for? Why did they want it? I didn't know who Cowrie was. I didn't know why he wanted it at the beginning. So I'm just throwing ideas down. And so who wants this thing and why? And what does it matter? Now, this is a pretty important point for me, and I think for any large element in your story. If something matters, it's probably going to have some kind of, well, either personal significance or cultural significance, maybe religious significance. If it matters to the characters, it matters for a reason, and I wanted to detail that. And in this case, it was going to be a cultural significance. These eggs mean something. They're very important to the people from the Lost Emeralds. And so I didn't know why. I had to think about what they did, what the Needlewing Dragons did for these people and how they treated them, maybe revered them, maybe reviled them, who knows? But I had to figure that out. And so I just started detailing that as well, just playing with the ideas, jotting them down. The ones that, stick and stand out, I use. The ones that don't, I just get rid of eventually. And then I continued. I started thinking about what the islands were like, what the people were like there, why there would be a caravan coming from these islands. What's the relationship in terms of commerce from these distant islands all the way to Anchorus? And the empire, of which Anchorus is one of the capitals, is very large and it has many different territories. And so it would make sense for something as distant as the islands to have commerce with the empire, and maybe they sort of prey on the islanders and take things that are invaluable to them and very valuable in the empire. And so I won't go over every single thing in detail. The point here is that you're starting to expand on your ideas, think about how things are related to one another, and understanding the world can help you come up with plot points. It can help you come up with character ideas and the relationships between them based on how the world works. One of the common themes in my talks is how in speculative fiction especially, but even in other genres, how character, world, and plot affect one another, how they can feed off one another and help you to create the story. And so I do like spending a lot of time on the world up front, but also during the writing of the story, because it can sometimes help break log jams and help provide ideas for how the story is going to go, how characters are going to act, built-in biases, that sort of thing. I'll also call out this one little bit. This is from a series, and so I want to keep Lorelai consistent. And so as I was editing book 2 in the series, I came across this little bit. Lorelai did similar things at crime scenes. Kellen had taught her the trick, but he admitted Lorelai took it further than he did. She's able to like look and review a scene after the fact. She is very, very sharp, but has trouble processing everything at once. And so sometimes it takes her hours, maybe even days, to fully understand what she witnessed and experienced at a crime scene. And she has a photographic memory. So sometimes she'll go back and use that and find things she didn't see up front. And it helps her to solve cases in the end. And I wanted to make sure that I highlighted that here because this is early in her career. And I want to see her maybe inexpert at that up front. Not completely so, but having her kind of expanding her awareness of herself and her own abilities. So here I'm starting to think about, well, who is Unbroken? Who is the character that is Unbroken, that is coming to the city of Anchorus and getting into trouble, and that Lorelai gets involved with? Also, it's to do with the dragon egg, so why is it prized? Some more about the islands and the dragons themselves and what the eggs are used for. It turns out one artist uses them to create these things that are kind of like Fabergé eggs. They're bigger, but he learned how to put calcite stones on them that glow when an unhatched dragon inside of that egg moves. That later became important because the eggs fell out of favor, and the main villain in this story, Hekatoro, is trying to sort of revive that in the Empire. He wants to sell these eggs for gobs of money, and so he found a way to infuse a soul into these eggs to make them glow much brighter than the prior eggs did, the ones his father created. And so this is starting to get me onto the thread of what happened to Tio, what is the egg about, why does anyone care about those things, why is he trying to sell it, and why is Kaori, the father, trying to get it back? He is the boy's father. Of course he wants it back. So he travels all the way from the islands to Anchorus and doesn't know anybody there. He's under threat because he's an outsider, and he's out to get his son back, essentially. Even though he's already dead, he wants his soul. He wants that egg back. And so this is me just trying to detail some of that stuff and expand on it. Okay, so the story is starting to mature at this point. I started detailing things about these stones that are being added to these eggs and how a soul being added to it could make them brighter. And that was kind of a turning point. That was what made me think, well, okay, somebody could die over this, or at least someone's soul is being taken. And I could see someone wanting that back, certainly, and going to great lengths to get it back. And so by then I felt the stage was fairly well set. Like I knew the background. I knew what happened beforehand, those initial conditions that I mentioned, and why Kaori was heading there, why Hekatoro was going there to sell that egg in the first place, and it sets things up really well. The boulder is at the top of the hill, and it's ready to roll down. And so now the question becomes, again, things were still fuzzy to me in terms of character, whose soul was stolen and under what circumstances? Who is hell-bent on getting the egg back? Who is the artist? Who is the one who quickened the wisp? Was it the same person or somebody else? Who dies, thereby starting the murder mystery? Again, this is a theft now, as it turns out, but in the beginning, I thought it was going to be a murder. And so whose soul was stolen? I started detailing that. Who's trying to get the egg back? The boy's father. And so things were pretty clear to me at the end of this brainstorming. There was one more thing I needed to work out before going a bit further with the plot. The practice of fixing souls into this egg is uncharted territory, legally speaking, in the Empire. That's what I was thinking. But the murder, of course, would not be condoned. So again, it went from murder to theft, but I still needed this to be something that the Empire would frown upon in some way. And so I had to work that out as well. And so the point here is I'm just looking at the logic of what's happening. I was thinking initially Kaori himself might be up for murder. Like the murder was an accident while he was trying to get the egg back. That's what I was thinking initially. And so maybe I could detail how the Empire treats these souls and work out some way, legally speaking, that Lorelai could use her smarts and her know-how of the legal system to free him and send him back home, essentially. That's what I wanted the ending of the story to be. And so I'm just trying to figure that out and make sure that that makes sense to me before I start writing. And so then, as with the dragons, I'm starting to think about these characters' names. And so I took time to figure that out. I didn't have it until this point. I went back and added it to the previous parts because once I knew, I wanted to fill that in, but I didn't know that until here. And so I just started brainstorming. Tio is the boy. Kaori is the father. The artist/merchant is a man named Hecatoro, part of the Walero family, and his father was the one who started this practice. At this point, I was starting to get the idea that this was not going to be a murder. It was not going to involve a caravan or an auctioneer. I mentioned I had that already in book 1, and that's what got me on that thread, but I didn't like the repetition. And so I wanted this to be something that was being sold through a curiosity shop. And so I got rid of those characters, those 4 characters, and I added Kalea, who is a jeweler. She runs the curiosity shop, and she's the daughter of a senator. And the senator himself, I had Senator Baracus, but it reminded me too much of B.A. Baracus from the A-Team. And so at first I was like, well, maybe I could keep it, and then it just bugged me, so I got rid of it. So Senator Thralius, who is the father of Kalea, and crucially, he is up for re-election. He can be embarrassed at this point. He's powerful, very powerful in the Empire and in the city of Anchorus. And so I was thinking, well, why would he care? You know, if he's selling these eggs, even though it's frowned upon in the Empire, even if it's illegal, who's going to stop him? Well, what if he's up for re-election? Well, that might make him pay a lot more attention to public perception of him and his daughter. And so I added that little element. And then I have other things like family relations to Kaori, a magistrate friend of Kellen who helps get this to a tribunal. Kaori is eventually taken into custody and he's up for a military tribunal, which could see him hung for a very minor offense, the supposed theft. Kellen talks to the magistrate at Lorelai's behest and gets a tribunal instead of a military trial to try to get some justice for Kaori. I don't actually remember what this disaffected is for. Whatever it was, I didn't use it. And then, again, some more notes. Is this a highly publicized proceeding? And this is to do with that re-election notion. I was just trying to work out the details of why the senator would care. So then, based on that, I updated my cast of characters. So I have the original ones, and then I got rid of some of the characters. I added Kalea, not Senator B.A. Baracus, but instead Senator Thralius, different family relations, the magistrate. And then I had a couple of bits of information that I needed before I started plotting again. So how does Hecatoro get to Anchorus? I was still working on this caravan idea. I started to reject that at this point. Hecatoro has some business partners that he inherited from his father. He has ways to get these into the city. And again, I still had to work at this notion of why these eggs would be illegal, but that was the idea. And then I mentioned early on that I wanted Creed. Creed has to stand on his own as well. He has to provide input and not just be sort of a sounding board for Lorelai. He has to help solve this case as well. And he has to help get Kaori free. And so maybe he's the one that comes up with the idea of putting the screws to the senator to get him to let Kaori go and to let this egg go too. We have to get the egg back to Kaori too, because that's his son. And so maybe Creed does that. He's putting his 2 cents in as well. He's chipping in. And so that's what helps him and Lorelai come together, see eye to eye, and for Lorelai to know he's a good guy, that sort of thing. I felt that was important. And then once I had all that, I was ready to go back into the plot. And so I have these opening early pages that I didn't need to touch it. It was pretty clear in my mind by that point. But the hook I could now add to. And so now I have a case of not a missing dragon egg, but a theft at a curiosity shop. And again, I have this notion of Lorelai slipping into this dream state. I wanted to make sure that was in the story somewhere. And then does she find some jewel? She does it through that process, essentially. So I added that little bit. Then flipping back to the ideas, I needed to figure out where this was ending up. Dan Wells talks in his talks on the 7-point structure about coming up with the ending first, the resolution, because that pulls the story forward. That creates kind of a narrative vacuum almost that pulls things along. It becomes so much easier. The reverse is like kind of pushing towards something you don't even know where you're going to end up. And it feels like pushing a wet noodle up a hill. Whereas if you know where you're headed, you know right away if ideas are leading you closer to that or not. So if I know the ending, it helps me a ton. So I'm a big believer in plotting forwards and backwards. I'm going to make a video on just that at some point, but this is what I'm doing here. I'm coming up with the ending so that it helps pull me along and make sure that the notes that I'm hitting throughout the story are the right ones. And so I detail how this is going to go. Cowrie is going to get taken eventually by the military. He's going to stand trial in theory, and the senator is the one who's making that happen. And so Lorelai talks to Kellen. Kellen pulls strings. They get this tribunal, and Lorelai is going to represent Cowrie in that tribunal because, again, she is so smart. She reads constantly, and she knows the laws inside and out. And so she's not an advocate, a lawyer in this world, but she knows enough to represent him. And so that's going to be her win. That's going to be the resolution of the tale. She's going to win the day for Cowrie with Creed's help. And so that gives me enough to go to the plot and start detailing plot turn 1. So this is kind of early on, and I'm thinking there's a bit of adventure and danger early on. There's maybe an attack of some kind. Maybe they try to go get Cowrie and he doesn't want to be taken, or maybe somebody else, Hecatoro and his allies, get involved. That's what ends up happening in the end. But I want to show Creed as streetwise, and he helps get them closer to Cowrie's whereabouts and helps Lorelai out along the way. He protects her. Then we get to pinch 1, part 3 of the 7-point plot structure, and this forces the characters into action. Lorelai and Creed head to the Atoll, which is a insular neighborhood in Anchorage that is mostly islanders. And so they're kind of in a almost foreign place. And this was my way of bringing the islands to Anchorage. I wanted to represent their culture in the city. And this is how I did it. They go to the Atoll, they get some of that experience by talking to those people and being around their culture for a time. And then Cowrie maybe escapes them. And then we get to the midpoint where we go from reaction to action. So I was thinking Creed was going to help here. This ended up being a little bit different than what I had detailed up front. But again, I'm just trying to expand on the plot, put stakes in the ground, even though later on I uprooted that stake and put it in a new place entirely. That doesn't matter in the end. You have to start somewhere. And that's what this structure is helping to provide. What actually ends up happening at the midpoint is they get Cowrie and he starts telling them about Tio and what happened and what Hecatoro did to his son. So that kind of moves them, like they're ready to help him at this point. They're no longer on their back foot. They know what happened and now they want to get this guy out of the city and back home with his son. Pinch 2 applies more pressure, the jaws of defeat. So they get Cowrie and then the senator calls on some contacts from the military and has Cowrie taken away, and he's going to face a military trial. Things seem really grim at this point. And then plot turn 2, the characters obtain the last piece they need to make it happen. And so Lorelai pushes Kellen to get a tribunal. And a tribunal, there's 3 systems of justice, and Anchorage is my thinking. And there's one for the military, one for civil, and one for religion. So the church has its own trials. And if there's any question about the proper venue, the way to address that is through a tribunal. And so 3 judges, one military, one religious, one civil, come together, facts are presented, and they decide if the venue change should be granted or not. And so that's what Lorelai pushes Kellen to ask for. That's what Kellen asks his magistrate friend to grant, and he gets it. So that's how we move into the trial where Hecatoro is exposed in the end and where Lorelai is representing Cowrie. And so again, I keep updating my characters as I move along, and I have the magistrate, Carcarus, High Shepherd Galastinia from the church, and Judge Advocate Peluvian. So I needed names for them, so I just jotted those down as well. And then finally, we're narrowing in on the ends. The climax of the tale, part 7, Lorelei rushes to the courthouse and she needs that egg. And so Creed is the one who goes off and gets the egg. The egg, Tio, has been taken away from them, and they figure maybe it's at the curiosity shop, maybe it's at the senator's house. So Creed says, I'll take care of it. You go to the courthouse and represent him. And so that's what happens. There's a trial. It's exciting. They get the egg finally. There's some scuffle between Cowrie and Hecatoro, and that provides enough of a delay for Creed to get back and bring the egg. And I have this notion in the world of wisps, especially souls of the dead, granting visions of their life. And so they all put their hands on the egg and they see the truth, and Hecatoro is exposed in the end. And so when they wake up, he's gone, Hecatoro. While they were in their trance, he escaped. So that leads to the ending where there's a final reckoning with him. So then we do get to the denouement. So I had trouble with this. I'm still actually, even though it's written, I'm not sure. It's not turned in yet, and I may change this, but Hecatoro shows up again. There's a confrontation. He dies. Tio is hatched as a needle-winged dragon. He comes out of the egg and he's reunited with his father, and they go back to the islands. That's the end. I may change that slightly so that he's hatched and goes back without Hecatoro being there at all. I just don't know. So even at this late stage, I'm still kind of debating on how the story is going to go. But this hopefully details the kind of things that you will do for your story. Brainstorm initially, put down things that stand out to you. It doesn't even matter what they are at that very early stage. And then slowly but surely, some elements of a story, whether it's the end, middle, or beginning, will start to come clear to you. And then you're going to want to detail the world and have it support that story in some way. You're going to want to think about the initial conditions, what led up to the opening and the inciting incident. Then you'll start filling in details. Again, the resolution, and for me, the denouement is important to know somewhere early-ish, because I want to be able to head towards those properly, have them help me pull the story along to plot that story. It really helps come up with ideas if you know where you're going. It helps with red herrings too, because you want to throw the reader off now and again. And if you know where you're going, you can send the reader in another direction and the characters in another direction that they recover from eventually. And then slowly but surely, you'll fill out your plot, whatever you use. It doesn't have to be 7-point structure. It could be 3-act structure or the hero's journey or what have you. But you'll fill that out in some detail until you feel confident enough to write the first page. And so before I could write that first page, I had a pretty good idea of what the story is about, but I needed a couple of crucial things before I could start writing. So I mentioned those eggs, like why are they illegal? Like why would anybody care if the senator, for example, was selling them, or the curiosity shop, the daughter of the senator who owns that shop? Who would care? I have to make that important to the story somehow. And so I started thinking about like, why would that matter? Again, the details here don't matter so much to your story. You just want to make sure that your story is internally consistent and that it's logical to the reader. And then also, I didn't know that it was just going to be a theft exactly. I thought it was going to be a murder. And so I was thinking, well, why did things spill into violence? And so I started thinking about ideas along those lines. When it became a theft, I did the same thing. I had to figure out, how did Cowrie figure out where the egg was? What did he do? How did he try to get it? Was he inept or good at it? Who found him out? And why was he reported? It turns out that the senator and his daughter Colea didn't want this reported. They wanted this hush-hush because they didn't want word to get out and to have it affect the senator's reelection. And so I had to figure out why they would do that too. And so again, you're just trying to figure out, make sure that you're comfortable essentially with where the story begins and where it's headed. I don't have to know everything before I start writing the first page, but if there's something that's really bugging me that I feel like is going to add or be affected by those early pages, I really have to stop and just make sure that it's solid, on solid ground. There is definitely a work in progress type of thing going on with me. I don't have everything up front. I don't write super detailed outlines, as you can see. Most of this is brainstorming. The actual outline is pretty sparse, really. And so I do come up with new things along the way. I consider the plot and the outline a map, not the territory, and I find new things along the way, and so I will adjust. But I at least want some structure. I want it to be fairly well defined. And so I push as hard as I can, and then knowing that eventually I have to start writing and new ideas will come to me. And if they do, and it forces me to rework the plot or characters a little bit, well, so be it. So what? What matters in the end is that the story itself is good. And so when those ideas come, and I'm totally fine with them now. It used to bug me a lot. It used to bug me that I couldn't come up with the entire story at once, but now I'm just fine with it. That's just my natural process. And so for you, start recognizing your natural process as well. You'll start to navigate this as you write more and more stories and get more and more comfortable with weaving between world, character, and plot before and after you start writing all the way through to the end. So in the end, just to review, I said I'd do this. So this is my 7-point story structure with 2 extras, so maybe 9-point story structure. So I have the opening. Lorelai receives her next case. It's from Kellen. He asks her to go with Creed, and it's a theft at an expensive curiosity shop. The hook. The shop owner, Kalea, doesn't want the case resolved, and she doesn't really say why. She just says they don't need any help. Plot turn 1. A man named Feldrin, who was on the scene at the time, he lies initially, but he shares with Lorelai that Cowrie and Hecatoro were at the scene of the crime, which Kalea did not mention. And so that gets Lorelai and eventually Creed thinking something weird's going on. Pinch 1. Hecatoro finds Cowrie and takes the egg from him. So Cowrie has stolen the egg and Hecatoro gets it back. He's got a lot of allies in Anchorage, so he manages to do that. And Creed and Lorelai are on the scene for that. So they see that happening. And then the midpoint is Cowrie reveals his story about what happened to Tio and that he's in this egg and he needs that egg back, and things feel kind of hopeless. Pinch 2 is Senator Thralius then has soldiers come to Creed's house where they're hiding out, and they take Cowrie away. And he's going to face a military trial, which could end up with him being hung. Plot turn 2, Lorelai has Kellen pull some strings with that magistrate to get a tribunal, and the resolution is that tribunal itself, and Lorelai and Creed free Cowrie by sharing visions from the egg. So Tio ends up saving his father, which was kind of fun in the end. And then the denouement, the Cowrie returns to the islands with Tio, who is now a needle-winged dragon. So that's it. And just one last pitch. The Unbroken Anthology is on Kickstarter. It's not yet live, but it will be, and you can be notified when it does go live. If you're seeing this much later, check it out. Tons of great authors, going to a good cause. Go ahead and click buy. I hope that beginning to end look at the early brainstorming and plotting of The Awkward Inquisitor and The Dragon Egg Thief gave some insights that you can use in your own stories. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll like and share news about the channel with other writers and writer groups. We're a small but growing channel, and every little bit helps. And be sure to hit subscribe for more behind the scenes videos like this one, plus deeper dives on writing, editing, and publishing. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.